Okay, why don't we go ahead and begin? I want to welcome everybody to this semester's International Affairs Speakers Series. We host one of these once a semester. Our speaker today is Mr. Gordon Chang, and I'll give an introduction to him in a second here, but first I want to give some thanks to those who have helped make this event possible. I want to thank the College Board of Trustees, the president of the college, Dr. Warren Nichols, and the Student Activities Board for their continued support. I want to thank the members of the International Affairs Speakers Committee, Professors Robert Castro, Stacy Henderson, Ching Lee, Rafael Naranjo, Shinya Wakao, and our dean, Dr. Steve Sewell, for all of their work and assistance. And then special thanks go to Kari Drake and Brad Dennison and Zach McWilliams for their help. Okay, now for the introduction. As stated, our speaker today is Mr. Gordon Chang. Mr. Chang is an attorney. In that capacity, he lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel to the American law firm Paul Weiss, and earlier in Hong Kong as partner in the international law firm Baker & McKenzie. He is a columnist at the news website The Daily Beast and is the author of 2 books, Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, published by Random House in 2006, and The Coming Collapse of China, Random House 2001. His writings on China and North Korea have appeared in numerous periodicals, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Far Eastern Economic Review, the International Herald Tribune, Commentary Magazine, the Weekly Standard, National Review, and Barron's. He's also appeared on television in many places. He's been featured on CNN, Fox News Channel, Fox Business Network, CNBC, MSNBC, PBS, the BBC, and Bloomberg Television. And for those, he was also once on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, if you know that show, of course. And he's a regular co-host and guest on the radio program, The John Batchelor Show. He is a graduate of Cornell University and Cornell Law School. The title of his talk today is North Korea, China, America, War or Peace, ? So he will speak on the current North Korean nuclear crisis and other topics. And that will be followed by a Q&A period, and Brad Dennison explained how that's going to work. Following the talk, there'll be a reception held in the Student Center, so please consider attending that, and you can speak more and meet our speaker, Mr. Chang. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Chang.
Thank you very much, John. With distressing frequency, the fiery leaders of the United States of America and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea make it sound as if we are just moments away from history's next great war. And unfortunately, Donald John Trump and Kim Jong-un very well may be right. Because of all this war talk, there's too much news. And because there is too much news, we all need a context for understanding developments. So today, I will give you my explanation of how we got into this distressing situation and how we can extricate ourselves and our friends and allies. And so as to not leave you in suspense, I'm going to summarize what I'm going to say. If leaving this auditorium, you can remember only 2 things, let it be this. First of all, the United States has overwhelming leverage over China, and China has overwhelming leverage over North Korea. And because of these 2 points, they lead us to one conclusion, that the United States, without the use of force, can disarm North Korea. And there's one more thing, that before striking North Korea, we have a moral obligation to exhaust all of the non-military options. So let's get started. First of all, how in the world did we ever find ourselves in this predicament? Well, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, over the course of 3 decades pursued misguided policies. And these policies were misguided for many reasons, but one of them is because they were based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions. And today, we're going to talk about 4 of those incorrect assumptions. First of all, a lot of people will say, oh, all the Kim regime wants is security. And there's a variation of that. You will hear people say that the Kim regime saw America overthrowing Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and decided that they needed a deterrent to preserve their position in Pyongyang. Well, maybe not. We have known that the North Koreans for decades have had a deterrent. For decades, the North Koreans have been able to kill tens of millions of South Koreans, including those in Seoul, the capital, with nothing more fancy than high explosives and chemical and biological agents. Yet the Kim regime has been pursuing nukes for a very long time. We have heard that Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean regime, actually talked to Mao Zedong in 1965, asking for him to share China's plans for the atomic bomb. And there are some indications that Kim was looking for the bomb right after the end of the Korean War, July 1953. We should not be surprised that the world's most militaristic regime wants the world's most fearsome weapons. A core goal of the Kim family is to take over South Korea. Indeed, extending its rule over the South is key to maintaining its position in Pyongyang. Korean Peninsula is the world's most interesting political experiment. You've got a lot of poor Koreans living next to a state with a lot of rich Koreans, and these are side by side, of course. Now, the destitute Koreans, the ones in North Korea, are willing to accept their fate if they believe that they're sacrificing for something important. And Kim rulers have said that what's important is ridding the Korean Peninsula of foreigners, in other words, Americans, and also extending Kim's Juche system to the entire peninsula. Kim Jong-un, the current ruler, needs to show progress in achieving this goal. And if he doesn't, there'll be even more defectors, like the one who crossed into South Korea on the 13th of this month. That makes the situation in North Asia inherently unstable. As soon as Kim feels confident in his arsenal, and that could be as little as 9 months from now, I think that we could see Kim trying to use the prospect of the incineration of American cities to get the United States to break its mutual defense treaty with South Korea, get our 28,500 service personnel off of Korea, and so therefore he would be free to intimidate South Korea into submission. Now, for many of us, that plan sounds outlandish. But we got to remember that candidate Trump, in March of last year, actually talked about the possibility of walking away from Japan and South Korea. And Kim Jong-un himself, in recent months, has been talking more and more about, quote unquote, final victory, which is North Korean code for taking over the South. So Kim Jong-un is not giving us the impression that he thinks that that goal is outlandish. Put all this together, in short, we are just not responsible for North Korea's nuclear weapons program. In short, Kim Jong-un has dangerous ambitions. The second incorrect assumption is that the North Koreans know it's no better than to take us on. And therefore, people assume that we can maintain deterrence in the Korean Peninsula. But the Kim family doesn't see us as especially fearsome. So Kim Jong-un can remember that his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, killed one American when they grabbed the Pueblo, an unarmed Navy reconnaissance vessel from international water in 1968. They held the crew for almost a year, and they got an apology from the Johnson administration. Kim may also remember that in the following year, 1969, Kim Il-sung shot down an unarmed Navy EC-121 in international airspace, killing all 31 aviators, the largest single loss of American life during the Cold War at the hands of a Cold War adversary. 1976, the North Koreans hacked to death 2 U.S. Army officers in the demilitarized zone. In none of these cases did Korea have to pay a price. The South Koreans also don't look to be especially intimidating. In addition to all the South Koreans that the North Koreans killed in the 1980s, and there were a lot of them, Kim Jong-un is thought to be responsible for the sinking of the Cheonan, a South Korean frigate, in March of 2010, 46 killed. Also in November of that year, the North Koreans shelled Yongpin Island, killing 4 South Koreans, 2 of them civilians. Although many Americans say that Kim Jong-un is irrational, it would not be crazy for him to think that he could kill Americans and South Koreans and get away with it. Now, we may think that we would retaliate, but maybe Kim would not think that way. And therefore, there could be a dangerous mismatch in perceptions. And because of this mismatch, there could be a failure of deterrence. We can deter states. We can deter even hostile states. We did that during the Cold War. We deterred the Soviet Union for decades, and we're deterring China now. But the question is, can we deter unstable states? North Korea, at this point, looks precarious. Sometimes it looks like to be on the brink of failure. Can we deter them? It remains to be seen. Here's the third incorrect assumption, that the North Korean threat would always be just over the horizon, that it would take a very long time for the North Koreans to threaten us with their nuclear weapons and their long-range missiles. Some people today even think that that threat is far away, that the Kimster cannot put a nuclear weapon on top of the 3 missiles that he currently possesses that can reach the American homeland. People say that his heat shielding doesn't work, that his guidance is lousy. These assessments, I think, are wrong, because Kim can do all these things either well or well enough. By now, we should see, and we should certainly assume, that Kim is making fast progress in not only improving his weapons, but also integrating all of his capabilities. The least likely explanation is that the North Koreans have been able to do this all on their own. That brings us to the fourth assumption, that China has wanted to help us disarm North Korea. We want the Chinese to help us. The Chinese have every reason in the world to help us. But there is disturbing evidence that China, on the contrary, is arming the North Koreans. On April 15th, the North Koreans paraded through Pyongyang in the Kim Il-sung Day Parade a very large canister that looks to be Chinese in origin. That canister is the one that Beijing uses for its DF-41 missile. The DF-41 has a range of at least 8,700 miles, and if launched from North Korea, can reach all of the American homeland. Now, this is not to conclusively say that the Chinese gave the DF-41 to the North Koreans. The North Koreans, after all, could have paraded an empty canister. Or the North Koreans could have stolen the plans from China, or they could have gotten them from a country to which China proliferated the missile, such as Pakistan. But the parading of this ominous-looking canister should lead us to ask Beijing some pointed questions. And we also need to ask China some questions about where the North Koreans got the missile that they tested on May 21st. The May 21st missile is the same that they tested on February 12th of this year. The February 12th missile is the land variant of North Korea's missile that they tested from under the surface of the Sea of Japan on August 24th. The August 24th missile, in turn, looks like it's designed in a variant of China's JL-1 submarine-launched missile. Are you noticing a pattern? That Chinese-looking missiles are showing up mysteriously in North Korea's inventory. And there's some more bad news. That canister I talked about was carried through the heart of Pyongyang on a Chinese launcher. The 16-wheeled launcher, we know, was manufactured by Sanjiang Special Vehicle Corporation, which is a unit of China Aerospace Science and Industry Corp. CASIC, as China Aerospace is known, is a state enterprise closely connected with China's People Liberation Army. Moreover, that enterprise also transferred the transporter erector launcher for North Korea's KN-08 ballistic missile. We know that because the Chinese actually admitted that they sold the chassis for that vehicle. As reported by the New York Times, the Obama administration talked to Beijing about this. And the Chinese said, yeah, we sold the chassis because the North Koreans said they were going to use them for logging vehicles. That explanation makes no sense on so many different levels, but especially because the chassis involved were wider than the roads leading to North Korea's logging areas. And indeed, sources inside the US intelligence community say that the story is worse, much worse than what the Times reported. These sources say that the Obama administration actually talked to China before the sale and transfer of these chassis, but the Chinese went ahead anyway. My sense, I can't prove it, but my sense is that the Chinese sold not only the chassis, but also the rest of the vehicle, the missile interface. Supplying the vehicle is critical because it made North Korea's missiles, for the first time, a real threat to the United States. We are not concerned by North Korea's longest range missile as a weapon. That's the Taepodong-2. Taepodong-2 takes weeks to transport, assemble, fuel, and test. We can kill it on the pad. But those other missiles, thanks to the Chinese, are mobile. Because they are mobile, they can hide. Because they can hide, we cannot, without any assurance, kill them before they are launched at us. And the intercontinental ballistic missiles that North Korea tested on July 4 and July 28, their first ICBMs, they rode to their launch sites on the backs of Chinese vehicles. China, we have to conclude, is weaponizing North Korea, giving it the capability of killing Americans. And by the way, the Chinese have also been transferring to the North Koreans components, equipment, and materials for North Korea's nuclear weapons program, including, most disturbingly, uranium hexafluoride, which is semi-processed fissile material. This flow of materials from China to North Korea has occurred over the course of decades and cannot be anything other than the result of conscious policy made at the top of the Chinese political system. Due in part to our wrong assumptions, we are entering a very dangerous period. President Trump last month called it the calm before the storm. So what can we do in this period of relative calm to prevent the storm? The Chinese, as we just discussed, have armed Kim Jong-un. Because of that, they can disarm him. Chinese diplomats are so fond of saying, "He who has tied a knot shall untie it." Well, the Chinese tied this knot, and they can untie it as well. Despite their repeated claims that the Chinese, tell us that they have no leverage over the North Koreans, their leverage over the North Koreans, as I just mentioned, is overwhelming. Because China says that they're good Marxists, let's look at some economics. China last year accounted for more than 92% of North Korea's external trade. China supplies more than 90% of North Korea's requirements for crude oil, much of it on concessionary terms. China supplies somewhere between 1/3 and 45% of North Korea's food, and that's especially important this year because the drought is the worst since 2001. There are some years when China supplies 100% of North Korea's aviation fuel. Beijing, as we also know, is Pyongyang's primary backer in diplomatic councils, such as the UN. As they say, the Kim regime could neither bark nor bite without China. Without China, there is no North Korea. China supplies many things to the North Koreans, but the most important is confidence. Confidence in the minds of senior regime elements in Pyongyang that they are safe. Safe from the United States, safe from South Korea, safe from the international community. Beijing may not be able to convince Kim Jong-un to give up his weapons. Maybe nobody could convince him to do that, but it doesn't really matter because Beijing can convince senior regime elements that it is no longer in their interest to support Kim's weapons programs or maybe even to support Kim himself, who, because of all these executions and purges, is increasingly unpopular. Now, many observers, especially Chinese ones, say, well, look, there's all these tensions between Beijing and Pyongyang. And yes, I see relations between the Chinese and the North Koreans over the last year is real. Kim Jong-un is genuinely unhappy with the Chinese, but that does not mean that Beijing is not in control. Chinese officials do not expect obedience all the time. Beijing supports the North Koreans, whether they are compliant at any one particular moment, because Beijing is confident that the North Koreans, at least in the long run, know their place. The Chinese know they have influence, they just choose not to exercise it all the time. The Chinese work hard trying to convince us that they have no power over the North Koreans, and they protest much too much. If the Chinese, in fact, had no influence, it's suspicious that the North Koreans, who this year have been launching missiles at the pace of one every 2 weeks, suddenly stopped in the run-up to China's Communist Party's 19th National Congress, where Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, demanded absolute calm so nothing would disrupt his drive to attain absolute power. And also, it's quite suspicious that Kim Jong-un himself sent a warm message of congratulation to Xi after the conclusion of the 19th Congress. And that certainly undermines this narrative that China and North Korea are apart. At the same time, China has overwhelming leverage over North Korea. We have overwhelming leverage over China. The Chinese economy is built on trade violation after trade violation, and that makes Beijing particularly vulnerable to retaliation, such as, for instance, the penalties that the Trump administration probably will impose after this Section 301 investigation into China's theft of U.S. intellectual property. Many say that we can't pressure China because we would start a trade war. Well, you can accuse President Trump of many things, but the one thing you cannot accuse him of is starting a trade war. We are already in a trade war. The Chinese are waging it, and we are being oblivious. In any event, we do not have to worry about what the Chinese could do to us. Why not? 4 things. First of all, last year, America's goods and services trade deficit with China was $309.3 billion. We're the trade deficit country. Trade deficit countries don't worry about trade friction because they've got little to lose. And we Americans should know that, because in the last big trade war, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, one country suffered more than any other. That was the United States, because we were the world's great trade surplus country. Second, the United States does not have an economy geared to selling things to China. China, on the other hand, on the contrary, has an economy geared to selling things to us. Third, for all the problems with the American economy, and it's not so bad, we're growing at about a 3% pace, but for all the problems with the American economy, our economy is stable. China's, on the other hand, is proceeding slowly, but nonetheless surely, to the world's greatest debt crisis. Fourth, despite everything else, we can push China around. Last year, our economy produced $18.57 trillion of gross domestic product. China produced $11.39 trillion. And that $11.39 trillion number, that's not real, because last year Beijing said that its growth rate of gross domestic product was 6.7%. That's exaggerated. Matter of fact, the World Bank about 6 weeks ago, and I'm sure they did this inadvertently, but the World Bank released a chart that if you actually did a little bit of arithmetic, you could see that the World Bank thinks that the Chinese economy in 2016 grew 1.2%. Bigger combatants always have the ability to push others around in a trade war, especially when the gap is this large. So in short, the United States holds the high cards. And by the way, China is susceptible to American pressure for another reason. Well, why? Because Chinese banks have been laundering money for North Korea. And when they've done that, they have violated American law. The Treasury Department on June 29th of this year designated Bank of Dandong, a Chinese bank, a primary money laundering concern pursuant to Section 311 of the Patriot Act. By doing so, we cut Bank of Dandong off from the global banking system because they can no longer do business in dollars, the world's dominant currency. In the last comprehensive survey of currency usage, the greenback accounted for 51.9% of all global transactions. Bank of Dandong, however, is just a small fry institution. We know that there have been larger Chinese banks that have been cleaning up cash for the North Koreans, including Bank of China, one of China's so-called Big Four banks. We know this because in 2016, the UN issued a report that said that Bank of China devised and operated a money laundering scheme for the North Koreans in Singapore, and it's almost certain that Bank of China has been involved in this dirty business in other locations as well. But as big as Bank of China is, and we really, by the way, should ask, why is Bank of China allowed to do business in our country when it's laundering money for the North Koreans? But as big as Bank of China is, it is probably not the largest Chinese bank that has been involved in money laundering. That title probably goes to China's biggest bank, the world's largest bank. That's the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. If Trump were to enforce US law and declare one of these big banks a money launderer, that would essentially be a death sentence for not only that institution, but perhaps for the Communist Party itself. So follow the logic. If Trump were to declare, let's say, Bank of China a primary money laundering concern, it would destabilize the Chinese banking and financial systems, especially if Trump were to designate other Chinese banks at the same time. If we destabilize the Chinese banking and financial systems, that pushes the Chinese economy close to the edge of the cliff. We push the Chinese economy over the edge of the cliff, and that means the Communist Party is surely not far behind. Now, designating Bank of China is not something that President Trump needs the permission of anybody else to do. He does not, for instance, need the vote of the UN Security Council. Now, nobody wants to put Bank of China down, but we cannot allow the Chinese to launder money for the North Koreans, and we certainly cannot allow them to arm the North Koreans so they can kill Americans by the tens of millions. At the end of this September, President Trump thanked Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, for ordering Chinese banks to cut their business ties with the North Koreans. It's not entirely clear that Xi Jinping actually ordered them to do that, because on the day following President Trump's words, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that what our president said was fake news. But in any event, we know that in the past, when Chinese banks have cut their ties with North Koreans, that they have actually resumed them months later when the rest of the world was not looking. Those Chinese banks go back to helping the North Koreans, as they did in the past. That gives America a hammer over China, because then Trump, just with the stroke of the pen, can begin a chain of events that could lead to the end of the Chinese system. And that gives our president all of the aces in the deck. And for decades, American administrations have not enforced money laundering and other laws against Chinese entities for fear of angering the Communist Party, and the Chinese just took advantage of that laxity. But that has to stop. And that is why President Trump's September 21 executive order is so important. His executive order basically tells the world that if you do business with the North Koreans, you're not doing business with the United States. And that's why it's such a big step forward. Now, many people reasonably say that this rule is so sweeping that it will never be enforced. But I say that the president must do everything within his power to enforce it. I cannot say 100%, I cannot say that if President Trump enforces his September 21 executive order, we can disarm North Korea peacefully. But I can say that if we do insist on disarming the North Koreans, we have an obligation, not just to ourselves, but to the rest of the world, to try to exhaust all of the non-military options before we strike the North. Let me also say that too many American officials these days are engaging in war talk. They're talking not just of a preemptive attack, in other words, an attack to thwart an immediate threat. They're also talking about a preventative attack, one meant to prevent an adversary from getting a capability of threatening us. This gives us the impression, unfortunately, that war is inevitable, that they are giving us the impression that it is easier to use force than to impose costs on North Korea's backers, such as China. There are times in history when what is necessary, such as imposing costs on China, there are times when what is necessary is not considered practical. And those times are almost always followed by uncertainty, turbulence, and death in great numbers. And I fear that we are at one of those fateful times. But let's also remember that we are Americans. We have done great things. And now, at this particular moment, history calls us again. Thank you.
Raise your hand for any questions.
My wife just told me the North Koreans just fired a ballistic missile, the first one since September 15th. Questions? Yes, sir.
Technically, we're still at war with North Korea, right?
That is correct. The question is, we're still at war with North Korea. The answer is yes, because the Korean War, as we call it, ended with an armistice, not with a peace treaty. And what's even worse than that, sir, is that the North Koreans, at least 3 times last decade, 2003, 2006, 2009, renounced the armistice. They did so again on September 25th of this year when the North Korean foreign minister in New York, at the conclusion of the UN General Assembly meeting, said that North Korea had the right to shoot down American planes in international airspace. So the North Koreans have abrogated the armistice.
Is that any leverage for us?
The question is that any leverage for us? And it is, damn right it is. Because if there is an armistice is an agreement not to use force. If there's no agreement not to use force, then we can do anything we want. So for instance, we could nuke all of North Korea if we thought it was a good thing to do. There's no agreement not to use force. The thing, I don't advocate doing that, but the one thing that I think we absolutely have to do, which we have not been doing, is to interdict North Korean ships on the high seas. Because the North Koreans, in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, have been selling weapons, especially to the Iranians. The Iranians each year pay the North Koreans somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion for their various forms of cooperation. Ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons cooperation. We need to stop that. Because there's no armistice in my view, we take the position there's an armistice, but that can't be right, because an armistice is an agreement not to use force. If one side says it's not abiding by it, there's no agreement. What we have when we say the armistice is in force is just a unilateral declaration of what we're going to do. If there's no armistice, we can actually sink North Korean ships. I'm not saying we should do that, but if we can sink them, we can certainly inspect them for weapons to make sure they're not selling the world's most dangerous instruments to the Iranians and to others. So it gives us enormous leverage. It would scare the crap out of Kim Jong-un if we were to say, yeah, we agree with you, there's no armistice. Yeah.
Does North Korea have thermonuclear weapons?
The question is, does North Korea have thermonuclear weapons? The answer is probably. The detonation on September 3 was estimated to yield 250 kilotons. That's more than just an atomic weapon. The North Koreans tell us they have hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons. I think that this is one time when they're just not exaggerating. Yeah, they got them. Question is, how did they get them? They didn't do it on their own.
Real quick reminder, please raise your hand and we'll get you guys the microphone for your questions for our filming purposes.
Would you say there's ever a future of just a whole Korea and not North and South?
The question is whether there's a future possibility of a unified Korea. Well, Kim Jong-un actually thinks so. The South Koreans used to think so up until about 1991. That's when they saw East and West Germany unite, and they saw the horrible costs that were associated with that. And so South Koreans then started to say, this unification thing, it can happen well into the future, you know. It's not happening now. Because first of all, you got to remember that as expensive as German unification was, it's be much more expensive for the South Koreans, because North Korea is much more destitute than East Germany, and North Korea is much bigger than East Germany was. North Korea is bigger in relation to South Korea than East Germany was in relation to West Germany. So it would be a tremendous financial toll on the South Koreans. So the South Koreans will talk about unification. They actually even have what they call the Unification Ministry, but they're not really serious about unification in any time frame which, you know, we would think possible. So yeah, it can happen. The one way it can happen, though, despite the best intentions, despite what the South Koreans want, is North Korea just fails on its own. And there's a lot of indications President Trump's strangulation campaign is actually starting to work. So for instance, junior officials in Pyongyang who are part of the regime's favored class aren't getting their rations from their special distribution channels. There are stories about how the regime is rounding up kids to work in labor camps to turn out products. You know, there's all sorts of anecdotal evidence which suggests, you know, North Korea right now is in a desperate situation, which is a real indication, of course, that you've got now the real possibility that the regime might fail, the North Korean regime might fail internally. And so that would be unification, unless, of course, the Chinese move south and grab even more Korean territory. But that's a whole different story.
So I was wondering why China exactly is supporting North Korea. I was wondering if it was for their economic growth or if it's because they don't like America, but they can't really do anything about it themselves because they're so reliant on America. So I was trying to kind of figure that out. And then I also heard that China will side with whoever attacks first. So it kind of makes me wonder, or do they just want a war to happen because war causes an economic growth in itself? So if China was involved in that, they could potentially get a lot out of it.
Okay, everyone hear that? You know, why are the Chinese doing this? Great question, by the way. You should work for PBS or whatever. It's not in China's interest to support North Korea. Matter of fact, if you look at this from especially a long-term perspective, you know, China is the biggest victim of North Korea. Because look, China is the natural hegemon of East Asia. If it's had nukes since 1964. If nobody else had nuclear weapons in the region, they would be really, really, really powerful. But a North Korea with just 30 or so devices basically evens up the balance. It reduces the marginal, the gap in the power between them. And if you think that North Korea getting the nuke will convince the Japanese and the South Koreans and people in Taiwan to develop their own weapons, it really is a detriment to China. Okay, so you would think that the Chinese would do everything possible not to arm the North Koreans, but the answer is, well, they're doing the opposite, and the reason is why. And there's really no good answers to that except this, and that is essentially, on a short-term basis, the Chinese find it very advantageous when North Korea does something provocative, as they did just a few hours ago, apparently. Because what happens when North Korea launches a missile or detonates a nuke? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we send our Secretary of State to Beijing to plead with the Chinese. You know, John Kerry, Rex Tillerson know how to get to the Chinese capital. And because of that, you know, we get to give them concessions on other things. We don't talk about predatory trade practices, cyber attacks, Taiwan, South China Sea, human rights, you name it. We don't talk about it when North Korea does something awful. So the Chinese, in the short term, find this to be very advantageous. And, you know, you've heard this, I'm sure, that people say, oh, you know, the Chinese are long-term thinkers. They think in centuries, and we Americans can only manage a calendar quarter. That is crap. It's crap because you look at what happens in North Korea. This shows that Chinese leaders are as short-term thinkers as any American ever was, because this is really bad for China. As a matter of fact, if we were actually cynical, we would not actually try to disarm North Korea. We would just sort of keep this up, let our allies build up their militaries, give the nukes to South Korea, which they definitely want them, really make life awful for China. Now, we don't do that because we're Americans, but we could, and this shows that the Chinese are engaging in counterproductive foreign policy. This is dangerous when a country does things that undercut its own interests.
So do you think they're doing it because they think that, we'll be more reliant on China?
And the question is, are they doing it because they think we'll become more reliant on China? And yeah, I think that it's probably right. We're not giving them a hard time on a lot of stuff. We think we need their help. So yeah, that's, I think, their short-term calculus in all of this. And the other thing that it leads to is that China is not our friend. A lot of people talk about China building a partnership, integrating them into the international system. No, the Chinese are basically proliferating the world's most dangerous technologies to countries that want to kill us. And so I think that we have to look at China not as a partner, but as an adversary, and maybe even as an enemy. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask, how would the president go about enforcing the September 21st executive order?
Okay. It's easy. It's just exerting political will. So for instance, if he were to actually be serious, he would start cutting off a lot of Chinese banks from their dollar accounts in New York. Every dollar transaction in the world, by the way, clears in New York City. So if we declare a bank to be a primary money launderer, they can no longer do business in dollars anywhere, except maybe in cash. But banks don't do that. So, that would be a demonstration of political will. It's just that, also I think the other thing that he would do is, the Chinese has all these state enterprises, so many different state enterprises, more than 100, and we treat each of them as separate, but they're all controlled by the Communist Party. And so what we should do is we should say, if China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation does something which violates US law, we should just say, we're not only going after CASIC, we're going to go after every state enterprise because they're all part of the same. They're just cat's paws for a bigger Communist Party. There's all sorts of things we could do if we had political will, but no administration up to now, for reasons good and bad, has been willing to do it. And so far, President Trump has only been willing to signal that he's willing to take action against the Chinese. We'll see whether he is willing to go further than that. There are people in the administration, such as the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Kushner, who have been counseling caution on China. And the one person in the Trump administration who has been urging a tough position against the Chinese is a fellow named Steve Bannon, who is now no longer part of the Trump administration. So I don't know how all that shakes out. But the one thing that I think about is Trump's got midterm elections in 2018. He campaigned against China. If he doesn't fulfill his pledges on China, there are some people in the United States who might actually decide to vote against Republicans. And this could be awful for the Republicans if indeed China, and remember, Bannon has said he will make China an issue in every race in the United States in 2018. Yeah. Yeah, toss the box.
Good throw, bad catch.
Actually, you should be. Did you watch the game last night? You should have been playing for the Texans. There were just so many bad passes from Tom Savage. But that's another story. Yeah.
Would you comment on the condition of the health of the North Korean guard who defected? We hear stories. I mean, is there any significance to that?
There's a lot of significance. The guard who defected on November 13th, who crossed the military demarcation line, remember, this was not just the demilitarized zone. This was the Joint Security Area, JSA, Panmunjom is sort of the village that people think about. The Joint Security Area is where North Korea puts the best of its best troops. That's because they are so politically exposed. That's where there's a lot of attention. So this guy came not from some poor family, but from probably his surname is O, but we don't know very much about him. He was a staff sergeant or something. But he probably came from a well-positioned family in Pyongyang because he's in the JSA. So this guy had dozens of parasites in his intestines, one of them almost 11 inches long. That says a couple things. One of them is that probably the North Koreans are using human excrement as fertilizer because they don't have chemical fertilizers. That's how you get these parasites. The other thing, this is gross, I know, but you did ask the question. The other thing that he had in his intestine is uncooked kernels of corn. You know, people don't eat that unless they're desperate. So here you got the best of the best. Soldiers who should be well fed are in obviously malnourished, whatever. So
Malnurtured.
yeah, thanks. It's a long day. Malnourished. There, I said it. So what this says is that there are problems all throughout North Korea right now. The general view among North Korea analysts is that in the last few years, people have been better fed. But I did mention that the drought this year is the worst this century, so maybe that has some effect. But you know, it obviously says that Kim Jong-un is taking all of his resources and putting them into missiles and nukes and not into anything else. So that's a suggestion that this is a dangerous situation for Kim. Also, it's dangerous because one other thing, and that is, yeah, the North Koreans have been malnourished for a long time, but we have never really tried to take advantage of it. This video we know about, it's the first time that the UN command, which is led by the US, it's the first time the UN command has released video of a defector crossing the demilitarized zone. And that means we wanted this video to get into North Korea. And the South Koreans, despite having a very dovish pro-North Korea president at the moment, President Moon Jae-in, have now started their amplifiers and have blasted this sound about the defection back into North Korea. Those speakers along the southern side of the demilitarized zone are now going full bore, which is an indication that the South Koreans are pretty pissed.
You said earlier that China was a very large importer of food to North Korea.
Right.
That soldier having, you know, just corn and obviously the farming in North Korea being poor, is that a sign of Chinese, what's the word, influence, I guess, at them trying to do something?
Yeah, China could do something if they wanted to. So for instance, they could, you know, much of the trade between China and North Korea is basically aid, concessionary terms. And so the Chinese supply a lot of oil. What China could do is just supply a lot of food. But it's not doing that for various reasons. Some of them is because China has gotten pressure from the Trump administration. Others, it's just China doesn't want to do it. China is overcommitted. It's got obligations that it's undertaken all around the world. And so therefore, it doesn't have, you know, the money to just feed every North Korean. Because if they were to do that, the North Koreans would stop, you know, any resources into agriculture because they figured that the Chinese are going to do it. Why should we? So, yeah, China could do it if they wanted to, but for various reasons, that just doesn't happen. And that's a part of the very intricate dynamics between Beijing and Pyongyang, which is inordinately complicated.
Has there been, or is there any intel indicating that there could be a possible uprising within the regime?
Within North Korea?
Yeah.
There have been various revolts in North Korea, but they've never really lasted that long. And the reason is that Kim Il-sung, the founder of the regime, developed really the world's most secure system. He had overlapping security units around the country spying on everybody. So for instance, there's a Ministry of State Security, but you've got security people in the army, security people in the Korean Workers' Party. So there's just overlapping, competing security agencies. Everyone monitors everybody else. And because of the way the regime is done this, it's made it, North Koreans are very afraid to talk to one another because they don't know who they're talking to. Even their best friends, even family members can spy on them. So it's very difficult to actually organize a revolt. And indeed, under Kim Jong-un, who's been in power since 2011, one general actually got executed for moving an army unit without getting permission from the top. So this is a rigidly controlled top-down society. And because of that, it makes revolts difficult. But Kim Jong-un has loosened the bounds because what he's done is since he's taken over on the death of his father in December 2011, he's executed somewhere about 150, 160 senior regime officials. And if you add in the junior officials who've been sent to the camps, we don't see that they died, the death toll could be somewhere in the 400 to 500 range, maybe even more. So once you do that, yeah, you intimidate opponents, but you create enemies because blood demands blood. And so, yeah, I think people are concerned that someone is actually going to take over. Matter of fact, if the Chinese put out the word that Kim Jong-un was no longer safe, probably you would see some ambitious colonel saying, well, why don't I be the next leader of North Korea? So there have not been any credible reports of a revolt in Kim Jong-un's era, but there were, in previous eras for Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. You don't have to have, a revolt to see the regime fail because it could just melt away all at once. Once someone gives a signal like China that it no longer is backing Kim Jong-un, you'd see the thing fall apart pretty quickly. That's why I said that the most important thing that China supplies to the North Koreans is confidence.
Thank you.
You've got a question, yeah.
You said recently that if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, it could draw in China, it could go nuclear, it could lead to 100 million dead.
Or more.
Or more.
Who knows?
What's the likelihood or possibility of an accidental war breaking out with those consequences?
Yeah, I think accidental war is much more likely than Kim Jong-un waking up one morning and saying, I really want to destroy Austin, Texas. 3 or 4 years ago, they disclosed that that map in a propaganda poster which showed a missile flight from North Korea to Austin. Yeah, it's possible, but not very likely. And to answer this woman's question, you, pink backpack, you asked a question, I forgot to answer the second part of it, and that is, Global Times, which is a tabloid, it's not official, but it is controlled by People's Daily, which is the most official publication in China. About 2 months ago, Global Times issued an editorial, which is not just anyone speaking, it's the paper itself. And that editorial was not official, but I think it did accurately reflect the thinking of the Chinese leadership. And in that editorial, it said, if North Korea strikes first, we're not honoring our mutual defense treaty with Pyongyang. But if somebody strikes North Korea first, we will go to their aid. So the reason why I think this is not just a US versus North Korea issue is because if we decide to strike North Korea first, China could very well come in on North Korea's side. So you have China, and if China comes in, you could have Russia. So this thing could become not just North Asia, this could become global. I mean, this is the way global wars start. World War I started because somebody killed an archduke. And nobody could have thought that it would have mushroomed out. And the one thing about the international system today, which resembles pre-World War I Europe, is that in that time, the situation was really complex. It wasn't like the Cold War where you had Soviet Union versus the United States, East versus West. Pretty simple to understand conceptually. Pre-World War I Europe was a mess. There were all these alliances, semi-alliances, secret alliances. Nobody knew who would come in on whose side. And because of that, it was extremely difficult for any country to manage the situation, which is the reason why shooting an archduke led to, the first global war. So we've got a situation which in broad outlines resembles that because we don't know what the Chinese will do. We don't even know what the Russians will do. And so therefore, this gets to be complicated. And that's why I think that this is not an issue of someone decides to kill somebody else. There's going to be a series of miscalculations that get to a point where it becomes a situation beyond control. Just a guess, but that's where we are.
All right, this is going to be our last question. As I walk this up, quick reminder, as soon as we're done here, head over to the Student Center for lunch and reception.
And I promise to make this answer short so you can all go over there and eat.
All right, so this is back on the whole executive order that was on September 21st. I'm assuming that we're trying to prevent the war and whatnot, so have we taken any other actions besides that executive order, and are there other things that we could possibly do to siphon out the resources from North Korea to prevent this war, or from anybody really?
Okay, I didn't quite get all that. So you're asking...
So what I'm getting at is, besides the executive order from September 21st, have we done anything else to siphon out resources from North Korea, or are there any other things we could do to prevent an actual war?
Yeah, really good question. Last week, the State Department designated North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. That carried with it about a handful of small sanctions. But a day after that, which was Tuesday of last week, Treasury Department designated one individual, 13 entities, and 20 vessels and sanctioned them. And that's probably not the end of it. There's going to be a series of sanctions on top of that. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening. But even apart from formal sanctions, U.S. officials have been going around the world convincing countries to end their economic ties with North Korea. So we're telling them, look, you got to send North Korean workers home. You got to close up your North Korean consulates. So there's been a series of actions that have occurred, and the Washington Post reported on this, a secret directive from President Trump, basically trying to wipe up all this cash. So this is an ongoing effort. And the issue is whether the United States has the capability to, forget about political will, whether we have, enough people in Treasury and in Justice to go around and enforce these sanctions and enough diplomats to do this. So we are doing it. And I imagine after this missile launch, that effort's going to be reinvigorated.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.